I am Celeste Bishop, and my age is 29. 11 years back, a mere 3 days prior to my 18th birthday. My mother and father called off my celebration because my elder sister wept over how it diminished her own sense of being unique. That very evening, I packed up and departed. My exit involved 2 duffel bags, $1,300 tucked inside a tin of coffee, and a call to the single grown-up who consistently paid me on schedule. The events that occurred 12 months afterward, during my grandmother's 80th birthday, gathering in a patch of flowers I had cultivated with my own fingers, remain a topic my relatives refused to voice. Standing out in that plot, my sister surveyed my entire creation and completely broke down with 30 of our family members looking on. The resulting conflict split our household cleanly in half, leaving a division that has remained unhealed. Yet, there is a fundamental truth none of them ever grasped. The fracturing of our family was not my doing. I merely ceased my efforts to keep the broken fragments together. I welcome you back to Last Laugh Stories, a space where women who were expected to remain unnoticed finally share their complete accounts with composure, right to the finish. For those of you who have ever managed to survive entirely on your own strength, this narrative is dedicated to you. Make sure to leave a comment and hit the subscribe button, as you will certainly want to stay tuned for the segment about that meadow. In order to clarify what happened on that birthday, I must first describe our home environment. Our household operated much like an emergency ward, where the person displaying the most severe crisis received all the resources, including finances, undivided attention, and the presence of both parents simultaneously. Brianna, my sibling, was perpetually the one creating the loudest crisis. By the age of 7, I had already calculated how this dynamic worked. When I was in 2nd grade, my musical performance happened on the identical night my 10-year-old sister experienced an abdominal pain that cleared up completely by 9 o'clock. Not a single person showed up to listen to my performance. On the drive back, my mother laid out the reasoning with the calm patience of a bank teller counting cash, stating that my sister required their presence and adding her assumption that I had performed beautifully. At 12 years old, I used saved birthday cash to buy a pair of white sneakers, which quickly became shared household property the very week Brianna announced her own shoes were pinching her feet. If my teachers offered compliments. My mother altered the narrative before bringing it to the dinner table, making it seem insignificant and minor so we wouldn't focus on it, as focusing on accomplishments was kept for other matters. My aim is to remain objective, as being balanced is the core purpose of sharing this. Physical violence was never an issue in my upbringing. My parents provided food, clothing, and rides to my classes. Yet, under the Bishop roof, being all right was not an emotional state but rather a designated role. I was given this duty at 7 years old and never received a single day of rest. My father was the only individual who recognized this imbalance. He would lock eyes with me over the remains of yet another spoiled night. Reacting with the expression of a bystander observing a storm he had no intention of seeking shelter from. When I was 15, he came across me pulling weeds from Grandma Ruth's garden plots during the summer and unexpectedly pledged that my 18th year would belong entirely to me to do as I pleased. I buried those words deeper in my mind than any seed I ever sowed, which turned out to be an error, taking 3 years to develop into the most painful night I have ever experienced. It is important to view my sister clearly, because this narrative does not portray her in a flattering light either, though for different reasons. That autumn, Brianna was 21, making her 3 years older than me, and she had already entered and subsequently dropped out of 2 separate universities. Every single departure occurred in the same fashion. A call in the middle of the night, a state of emergency, and our mother leaping into action like a military squad. No one in our household ever uttered the word failure. Instead, they claimed Brianna lacked adequate assistance or possessed a higher level of sensitivity than the average person. Every breakdown was rebranded to sound like a clinical condition, and each of these diagnoses came with an invoice my parents considered it a privilege to settle. I only grasped the reality of the situation much later. They shaped her personality themselves. Starting in infancy, Brianna was taught that she was delicate, so she grew to be exactly that. Her entire identity was built on having needs, in the exact same manner that my identity was built on having none, with both of our roles established before we even learned to speak. To best illustrate this, look at the night of my 4 banquet during the spring I turned 16, when I received a county ribbon for a raised bed setup I had planned myself, which was my very first public success. To my surprise, my parents actually showed up, but Brianna phoned from a parking lot weeping over a boyfriend, causing our dinner to finish before the prizes were even handed out, leaving me to travel back with my ribbon sitting on my lap. Upon entering the kitchen, Brianna noticed it, and her expression fell as if she had been hit, complaining that her evening had been terrible while I stood there with an award. Insisting that the focus should be on her at that moment, she spoke these words as if stating an official policy, which was indeed how things functioned in our home. Our mother prepared a cup of tea for her, while no one inquired about looking at the ribbon, forcing me to secure it inside my closet door, where my personal belongings were forced to reside. Soil became my escape. At 14, I began working on weekends at Hollis Greenhouse located on the town's outskirts, moving trays of plants and cleaning pots for June Hollis, a 63-year-old woman shaped like a wooden stake who was physically incapable of giving insincere praise. Her compensation consisted of monetary pay, rolls of her eyes, and blunt counsel, meaning she compensated me far better than anyone else ever had. By 17, I was capable of managing the seating room by myself, and I deposited all of my earnings into an account at First Hartwell Bank, amassing $9,412 by that September, representing 3 years of Saturday shifts. A single crucial point is that I opened this account at 14, and because the bank mandated an adult's signature, it was set up as a joint account with my mother. When I reached 17, I inquired about establishing an individual account, but the clerk explained that I required a parent's signature until my 18th year. My mother offered a grin, advising that we take things one step at a time after my birthday, a phrase she repeated in June and once more in August. For the record, I was fully aware of what she was doing, which prompted me to begin taking portions of my earnings by cashing minor sums. $20 on one occasion. 40 I regularly slipped the folded cash inside an old coffee container that sat hidden behind my heavy winter boots. Once September arrived, those savings had accumulated to $1,300. I tried to dismiss my anxiety as sheer paranoia, reasoning that a parent shouldn't require constant monitoring like an incoming storm. In hindsight, my fears were completely justified, and I was merely being naive. The remaining funds stayed untouched in the bank because a minor's authority is helpless against a joint signer, and a lingering part of my mind still viewed that account as a cooperative project. In reality, it was a plot of land registered to another person that I was doing all the labor on. My envisioned celebration would hardly qualify as an actual party to anyone else. It was just a quiet dinner hosted on Grandma Ruth's lawn. I wanted to hang glowing strands through the branches of the maple tree. There would be a simple sheet cake ordered from Hartwell Bakery. It was going to be chocolate flavor with a creamy center, featuring my name spelled out in yellow frosting. 15 guests would sit on temporary folding chairs. June had received her invite and jokingly promised she would show up. That comprised my entire wish. Just a single night around a single table. For a brief moment, everyone would look toward the exact same spot, and I would be the one they were looking at. My father had given me his solemn word. For 3 long years, I guarded that commitment like a packet of seeds, constantly verifying its viability. Reaching my 18th year represented a massive transition. Having secured my spot in the state's spring agricultural course, I could see a distant but concrete vision of the only life I desired. I wanted to establish a commercial flower farm under my own name. It was Grandma Ruth who originally planted this vision in my thoughts. Behind her home on Maple Street, she cultivated a deep crimson variety of dahlia that her ancestors had kept alive since my father's birth. The blossoms had such a rich texture that they resembled dark velvet soaking up the sun. During that August, She guided me along her garden rows, touched one of the flowers, and pointed out that blossoms never offer apologies for occupying their soil, asking me if I observed how they grew. I certainly did, recognizing the truth of her words as clearly as someone spots a wide, open doorway. But 3 weeks prior to my birthday, Brianna declared her intention to enroll in a third educational course, focusing on wellness and design in Columbus. She insisted it was highly prestigious and required immediate action. A down payment had to be submitted immediately, she claimed, otherwise her slot would be handed to a candidate with supportive parents. My exact position in the kitchen at that moment remains vivid because of the sudden silence that fell, a specific quietness I had learned to decode as a kid. In our household, that particular hush always indicated that finances were being diverted elsewhere. Brianna managed only 11 days in Columbus before returning on a Friday, just 4 days prior to my birthday. She arrived back at the house at 1:00 a.m. The sound of the front lock turning woke me up. Then came that specific pitch of her weeping, the one that signaled the entire household would have to bend to her emotional state. By the time breakfast came, a heavy tension filled the air. My mother navigated the kitchen like an emergency room nurse, whispering quietly into her phone. Staring at the table surface, my dad sat quietly with his mug, occupying the center of the sofa. Brianna wrapped herself in our best blanket and complained about how unfairly Columbus had treated her to anyone walking by. I toasted some bread and kept my mouth shut, performing my designated role. That night, I caught my mother in the corridor talking to my father's sister, Aunt Patty. She was speaking in her calm, hushed tone used for arranging logistics. It was the exact voice she used when shaping a narrative for external consumption. I overheard her ask what would be the most suitable path for the family in the present moment. Then came a quieter remark directed toward me, though she left my name out of it. She muttered that I had my entire life ahead of me to host celebrations. I was in my room holding a stack of paper invitations I had manually lettered. They were never mailed because some protective instinct had stopped me from making the plans official. I had 15 completed envelopes. On each piece of paper, I had sketched a tiny dahlia. I slid them upside down into my desk, trying to convince myself that the logic might still hold up. Surely, even in our crisis-prone household, reaching age 18 was a unique milestone that took priority over a simple case of homesickness. Saturday morning arrived, and my mother tapped on my bedroom door, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. She spoke with her overly cheerful, present-giving tone, making it immediately clear which promise was about to be rescinded. Seating herself at the side of my bed, she forced a sympathetic look onto her face. She brought up Tuesday, and I realized my milestone birthday had been demoted to just a random day on the calendar. She explained that she and my father had discussed it, and decided that holding a party during my sister's current struggle would only aggravate her emotional wounds. If she witnessed me celebrating while her own life was in shambles, it would completely crush her. I questioned what their actual proposal was. My mother cheerfully suggested we put it off. We would wait only until Brianna felt more stable. Later on, we would have a modest, family-only gathering. In the Bishop home, the word later was the place where all my hopes were buried. I stared back at her and took a risk I had never previously dared during any of our household negotiations. I asked her the hard question. I wanted to know when my own day on the family schedule was coming, and asked to see where it was written. Her expression faltered for a second before hardening, and she spoke the words that have haunted me for over a decade. She told me to stop being dramatic, claiming I had always been perfectly capable of handling things by myself. And there it was, the unstated rules of our family finally spoken aloud. My job was to be okay, a price I had to pay to keep our family functioning smoothly. My father showed up in the doorway right behind her. This is the specific detail that remains clearest in my memory. He met my gaze, fully understanding the situation. He remembered his assurance that my 18th year would belong to me. He rested a hand on the frame of the door, beginning to speak, but Brianna's tearful and demanding voice echoed from downstairs, and he disappeared. In less than half a minute, a commitment nurtured for 3 years completely dissolved. patting my knee as she left the room. My mother remarked that I would comprehend her actions once I had an emotionally fragile child of my own. After they left, I remained completely motionless. Hearing the household adjust its routine to accommodate my sister on the lower level. I refrained from screaming or pleading with them. If you have ever had to play the resilient sibling, you understand why. It comes down to sheer practice. It all started when I flipped open my laptop to review the funds in my savings account. Later that night, I got a call from the bakery, but they weren't canceling my order. Instead, an employee from Hartwell Bakery wanted to verify the adjustments made to Order 41. When I explained that I hadn't requested any modifications, she cheerfully went ahead and read them off anyway, completely unaware of how painfully each detail hit me. The chocolate cake itself was the same, but the collection date had been moved to Saturday, and the text on top had been altered. They were still preparing the exact cream-filled sheet cake I had picked out back in July, except my name had been wiped clean from the order form. The new label simply read, "Welcome home, Brianna." An encouragement dinner was scheduled for that Saturday, 4 days after my own birthday would go entirely ignored, and I would eventually discover that the invite list was virtually identical to mine. The exact same aunts, cousins, and metal folding chairs were being used. They hadn't delayed my celebration at all, they had cannibalized it. Since the bakery worker wasn't to blame. I politely thanked her before hanging up, standing frozen in my bedroom as a deep, flat quiet settled over my chest, like a field stripped bare by a harvester. We often imagine massive life decisions occurring in a burst of fiery emotion, but mine didn't. It settled in the way frost does on a silent, cloudless night when living things simply stop growing. Reaching up, I grabbed a pair of duffels from my closet shelf. I filled them with my working attire, boots, a decorative ribbon from the closet door, and 15 letters that had never reached the mail. After pulling my hidden coffee can from behind my heavy winter footwear, I blindly felt and counted the bills inside. Sitting down on the mattress, I dialed the only adult in my life who had always compensated me promptly and intentionally. June Hollis didn't need to hear more than 10 seconds of my story. She told me there was a cot in the loft above the seed room, adding, "It gets cold up there. Rent is $40 a month, and you'll be working for it before the sun comes up. You can either show up or not." Even though my birthday was 3 days out, I decided not to wait for it and left that very night. Departing the place where you were raised takes barely 4 minutes when you have spent your entire life packing your bags subconsciously. I walked down the steps with a bag slung over each shoulder. My mother sat at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of tea. She cast her eyes over my luggage and then to my face, opting for annoyance instead of panic. "Oh, Celeste, stop being so dramatic," she sighed. "Where do you think you are going, exactly?" I explained that I had an early shift, which was the absolute truth, and kept the rest of my thoughts to myself. From her spot on the sofa, Brianna observed everything with her blanket pulled right up to her chin, and for a fleeting moment, her expression betrayed a hint of jealousy. Jealousy of my bags, of the exit, and of someone who actually had the freedom to walk away. My father stepped out onto the porch behind me. He placed a crumpled envelope into my palm containing $60, mostly in crumpled $5 and $10 bills. It was the pocket change of a man who had been secretly stashing away small bills in a drawer over time. "Make sure you phone your grandmother on Sundays," he advised, "otherwise, she's going to worry." He never once begged me to stay, and the silence of that unmade plea was deafening to both of us. I covered the 2-mile trek to Hollis greenhouse on foot, walking beneath an early autumn sky that looked like a deep, dark plum. The moment I stepped inside the seed room, the rich, warm scent of earth welcomed me like an old friend. Upstairs, the loft was just as drafty as June had warned. As I rested on the small cot, a realization I had been avoiding for years finally clicked into place. Pretending everything was perfect was the price of admission for staying in my family's home, and that night, I decided to stop paying it. My 18th birthday arrived 3 days later, celebrated with a simple store-bought cupcake and a single candle that June had awkwardly provided. The following Wednesday morning, I went to the bank to retrieve the funds I'd saved up from 3 years of working weekends. And that is when the teller's expression shifted. I wanted to set up a brand new, independent account that didn't require any parental signature and transfer all my hard-earned money into it. But when she retrieved the details of our joint account, her smile faltered in that distinct way bank tellers' faces do when the computer screen tells a different story than the client. The total remaining was $912. An amount of $500 had been pulled out 3 weeks prior, which perfectly lined up with the payment deadline for my sister's highly selective program in Columbus. All of the delays suddenly became crystal clear, especially my mother's patronizing requests to wait until after my birthday to handle my finances. She hadn't been absent-mindedly forgetting to sign my banking papers. She was intentionally keeping her access open until she finished taking what she wanted. I want everyone listening to pause and think about this. It was entirely legal. Because both of our names were on the joint account, the law saw nothing wrong with it, meaning she hadn't legally stolen anything. She simply took 3 years of my weekend labor and poured it into a course that my sister abandoned after just 11 days. I gave her a call right from the bank parking lot, and she answered without a moment's hesitation. "In our family, money goes to whoever needs it most," she declared. "Celeste, your sister's entire future was at stake. You have your health and your youth, so you'll make that money back quickly." Then her voice softened, like she was throwing me a patronizing bone. This is just how families operate. I walked back into the lobby, took out the remaining $912, and shut down the account without my hands shaking once. It was only when I got inside the truck that June had let me borrow that I finally allowed myself to tremble. By the time Sunday rolled around, my mother had already spun her own narrative to the rest of our relatives about my birthday, my suitcases, and the bank account. I discovered this when I checked my messages. I had suddenly become the antagonist in a script I didn't even know was being written. The official narrative accepted by the Bishop family was that Celeste threw a massive tantrum over a party, deserted her struggling sister during a psychological crisis, and ran away out of pure spite. This tale circulated through the local church, the Hair Salon, and was heavily bought into by my father's sister, Aunt Patty, who was the one who left the recording. "I'm just so let down, honey," she said in the message. "Your mother is absolutely devastated. Over a party, Celeste? Are you serious?" I didn't bother calling her back to plead my case, and I want to tell you why. It's because it simply wasn't my mother had spent over 5 decades, 52 years. To be exact, perfecting her role as the family's official storyteller. Trying to debate her with everyone watching felt like facing off against a Hall of Fame athlete on their home turf. So, I chose a different path. My truth would rise quietly from the soil, where no one could interrupt or drown it out. On the initial Sunday of October, a brown, mud-splattered sedan pulled onto the greenhouse property, bringing my 79-year-old grandmother, Ruth. Holding a cane with one hand and clutching a shoebox beneath her opposite arm, she stepped out. She scanned the seed room with the sharp, critical eye of a farmer checking a fence line before placing her box onto the potting bench. Nestled inside a bed of wood shavings lay several dahlia tubers, lumpy, unattractive, yet utterly wondrous roots. She had harvested them from the deep red row situated right behind her Maple Street home. That particular variety had been preserved by her family since the very year of my father's birth. "Do you know what you're looking at?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. "Put these in the dirt where people will notice them." She gave my cheek a light touch with her dry, paper, thin hand, mentioning she was running late for her television show. I managed to keep my composure until her car's red tail lights were fading in the distance, and then the tears finally came. It is worth noting that a simple act of generosity is what broke me. Having my money stolen hadn't brought me to tears, but receiving this gift did. During those autumn and winter months, my daily routine became incredibly predictable. From 5:30 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, I was at the greenhouse, carrying heavy loads, watering plants, and memorizing every detail of June's seed room, as if it were a sacred text. After that, I worked the evening shift at Rosie's Diner until 10 o'clock, serving plates of meatloaf to patrons who paid their tips in loose quarters and unsolicited suggestions. Returning to my loft, I would study June's heavily worn gardening guides until my eyes grew blurry, absorbing concepts like cold tolerance, succession planting, and how many stems to grow per foot of a row. I covered page after page of a spiral, bound notebook with designs, only to scratch the majority of them out. An exercise June promised me was actually the core of the entire business. Around this time, I contacted the state agricultural school to push my start date back by 12 months. I cited financial struggles as the reason, which was true, but there was another factor at play. Between the moment I lost my savings at the bank and the moment I received that shoebox, my entire vision for the future had shifted. On the other side of town, my stolen $500 had funded a college semester my sister abandoned halfway through, leaving her confined to her bedroom. Grandma Ruth would deliver Sunday updates with a dry matter of fact delivery. Brianna was resting, my mother was coping, and my father was busy cutting grass that had actually stopped growing back in October. Let me take a quick moment here, because I suspect some of you are enduring a very similar season in your lives right now. If you have ever pulled double shifts while the individual who wronged you was fast asleep in your former room, please share your experience in the comment section below. I make sure to read every single one. And if you find yourself connecting with this journey, please subscribe right now, because we are about to reach the moment where everything begins to shift. As Thanksgiving drew near, my mother, true to her nature of capitalizing on every major holiday, called me on the preceding Monday. Her tone was as comforting and warm as a fresh casserole. She invited me home, calling our estrangement silliness, and claiming the family was ready to forget my emotional reaction. Knowing her conditional style of forgiveness, I inquired what moving past it actually required. She recited her demands as systematically as a cooking recipe. First, I had to issue a public family apology to Brianna for turning her personal setback into my own drama. Next, I had to return to my childhood bedroom so they could monitor me. Third, since I was so eager to hold down jobs, I would have to pay my share of the household expenses. And finally, I needed to abandon this temporary farming hobby before making a fool of myself. As she spoke, my eyes drifted out the window of the loft to June's vacant rear field. 2 acres of frost-covered, dormant grass, and an unexpected sense of peace washed over me. What happens if I decline? I questioned. Her tone chilled slightly as she addressed me. We worry about your sister Celeste. She is fragile, whereas you have always been perfectly fine. Honestly, it is the one thing we never had to think about. There it was. The primary, unspoken rule of our household. I expressed my appreciation for the offer, but explained that I was scheduled to work on Thanksgiving morning. And heavy, palpable silence filled the line. In that case, do not show up for Christmas either, she snapped before cutting the connection. Ending the call abruptly was her signature move. For a few moments, I simply held the receiver to my ear, listening to the empty dial tone. I had no idea at that moment that nearly 10 months would pass before my mother and I spoke again. By the time we finally did, the entire landscape of our relationship would be unrecognizable. On Christmas Eve, with the greenhouse locked up, my living space was so incredibly still that the low hum of the propane heater sounded like it was on the verge of failing. I won't sugarcoat this moment, because I know many of you have found yourselves in this very same position. I decided to write a holiday card to my mother. It required an hour and 4 separate attempts before I stripped it down to the absolute bare minimum. Merry Christmas, Mom. I am doing well, and I have a job. But as I held the stamp to my tongue, a realization hit me with the distinct, adhesive taste of glue. This note wasn't meant for the woman who actually raised me. I was sending it to a fictional mother of my own creation, someone who would stand by her kitchen sink, get emotional reading my words, and immediately bring me a warm drink. That person simply did not reside at my family's house. So, I stored the envelope in a drawer alongside 15 other invitations I had never mailed, watching my stash of unposted letters expand. Near 8 o'clock, bright beams of light illuminated the driveway, and Grandmother Ruth walked right into the seed room, holding a container of molasses cookies. She offered absolutely no details regarding what excuse she had given my mother and father to slip away. Together, we snacked on them beside the warming mats for the sprouts while she reviewed my handwritten plans like a solitary inspector. A description that, in hindsight, fits her perfectly. Around 9, June made her way inside, carrying an item wrapped securely in brown butcher paper, along with a dense, premium roll of striped gross-grain ribbon. She told me it was intended for my inaugural market day. Put it on the table, she challenged, daring me to let my emotions show. I refused to give in, but once they departed, I set the spool on the windowsill where a card from a make believe mother should have been. Sitting there, it looked exactly like what it represented: a gamble. 2 elderly women had just placed their bets on a girl who had nothing but $900 and a cardboard shoebox to her name. By January, June decided to up the ante herself. The offer she extended came with a ruthless contract and absolutely no mercy. During the second week of January, June guided me out to the frozen back pasture wearing boots and a deceased man's barn coat, and presented me with a choice that would permanently divide my existence into a before and an after. The deal was for 2 south, facing acres right behind the greenhouses, complete with a water line already hooked up to the old sheep trough. I don't do charity, she declared before I could even open my mouth. Her terms were 3 growing seasons at $900 per season, with the first payment due up front. I had to provide all my own labor, purchase my own seed, and carry the weight of my own failures. Everything had to be documented in a signed agreement, so neither of us could get sentimental about it. Paying that $900 would clean out nearly all of my savings, and every penny remaining in my coffee can after buying seed catalogs was already spoken for. I needed to buy silage tarps, trellis netting, and a shaky, pre-owned walk behind cedar. Standing on the frozen ground, I calculated the numbers 3 separate times. The math clearly warned me against it, but something beneath the calculations insisted that now was the time. That Friday I signed the lease at her kitchen table. 2 acres, $900, and a shoebox. That was my entire inheritance, and as it turned out, it was all I needed. During that very week, an official letter from the state's agricultural program arrived on my windowsill, asking me to confirm my deferred enrollment. I deliberately allowed the cutoff date to pass. To be completely honest, making that choice terrified me far more than running away from home ever did. Back then, at least I had a destination to walk toward. This time I was stepping completely off the edge of my own map. I was just an 18-year-old with no college degree, no family, and zero safety net, farming on a lease. But you can never grow a crop if you keep one foot outside the gate. As the soil began to soften that February, I nestled Grandma Ruth's deep red tubers into trays of moist wood shavings to coax them out of dormancy. Remarkably, the very first green shoots poked through on the exact day the local county newspaper would have arrived. The one that would have labeled my venture a foolish mistake. The arrival of spring quickly humbled my pride. Having started several early rows of sweet peas and ranunculus, I decided to transplant them into the ground ahead of schedule in late April. The 10-day weather outlook looked perfect, and I wanted to get an early start on harvesting for Mother's Day. But then, a cold front descended from Canada during a still, cloudless night. It was a silent frost that gave no warning, the sort that quietly shows up and gets to work. At daybreak, I paced the garden beds in the freezing air, looking at $400 worth of ruined seedlings that now resembled soggy brown rags. The worst part was that I knew better. The farming manuals June lent me had warned me, and June herself had said the same. I chose to ignore the advice and take a risk anyway, because optimism can be a beautiful layer. Sitting on a flipped-over bucket at the edge of the ruined crop, I allowed myself precisely 60 minutes to wallow in disappointment. After that, I grabbed my logbook to record the temperature, the date, and what I had learned. Feeling sorry for yourself doesn't make good fertilizer, but keeping detailed logs does. Around 7 that morning, June walked out to look at the destruction. She stood there with her hands tucked inside her pockets and offered a brief summary. A freeze isn't a life sentence, kid. Think of it as paying your dues. So, we went back to sowing. I shifted my focus to more resilient varieties, putting in sunflowers Cosmos zinnias and setting up low tunnels over the snapdragons. I also watched over the dahlia trays as if they were newborns in an intensive care unit, because those tubers weren't ordinary flora. They represented the single-family legacy I had ever been given. When the final week of May rolled around, the bare grit of the soil had transformed into vibrant green lines. They were aligned so perfectly that June actually let out an approving grunt, which was the highest praise she could possibly offer. However, by the opening Saturday of June, a dilemma arose that I hadn't prepared for in my log. I found myself with container after container of freshly harvested, pristine blooms, but absolutely zero venues to market them. Thankfully, you can secure an 8-foot spot at the Hartwell Farmers Market on Saturdays for just $15. I booked a pitch right between a honey producer and a lady selling soap made from goat's milk. After setting up a folding table I had borrowed, I decorated it using some of June's striped ribbon and a chalkboard sign I had hand-drawn at midnight. I advertised assorted bundles for $15, showcasing iridescent zinnias, cosmos, snapdragons, and vibrant blue bachelor's buttons. Having packaged 30 arrangements in brown wrapping paper, I was secretly sweating at the thought of packing 29 of them back into my car. My very first sale was to a former schoolteacher who purchased a pair of bouquets and mentioned that actual locally grown flowers hadn't been available there for ages. By 10:30, I had to reach for the reserve buckets underneath my display to replenish the stock. By midday, my inventory was completely gone. I had collected $340 in an old cigar container, primarily in $5 bills, and my face actually hurt from smiling so much. Obviously, $340 isn't a fortune. It's less than what I would make working double shifts for a week. Still, those specific bills felt special because they were literally grown from the soil I had committed to with my own name on a lease. That kind of income has a unique value. In a close-knit place like Hartwell, news travels fast. A pair of women from the church my mother attends paused at my stand, realized who I was, and suddenly developed an intense interest in examining the sweet peas. Even before the market hours ended, my phone lit up with a call notification from a number that hadn't contacted me since Thanksgiving. The text was incredibly brief. A market stand. Good job. That was all she wrote. If you've ever dealt with a parent like mine, you know precisely how those words sounded in your head. It was the kind of praise that carries a heavy dose of pity. After reading the screen twice, I slipped the device into the metal box alongside the currency and handed off my remaining 3 floral bundles. I chose to leave the text on read. Throughout the summer, my crops did all the talking for me. Come July, a bride to be named Hannah paused at my stand, became misty-eyed looking at the snapdragons, and inquired if I offered wedding services. I agreed instantly, displaying the prompt confidence of someone who had never actually styled a wedding. The price was $850 for late August, which included the bridal bouquet, 5 jars of flowers for each table, and the floral arrangements for the arch. I dedicated 2 weeks to reading and spent one entirely sleepless night before placing the stems in every container June owned. Eventually transporting the whole lot in a cooler I had fashioned out of a chest freezer box and bags of ice. Late August was precisely when the dahlias bloomed. Grandma Ruth's crimson blooms burst open like fat saucers of that unbelievable velvet red, and I constructed Hannah's bouquet around 9 of those stems. During the reception, 3 different women approached the caterer to ask who had arranged the flowers. Pointing across the room in my direction, the caterer replied, "The Dahlia girl," and the nickname stuck in that permanent way only accidental names do. Hannah's mother booked her own anniversary party right there on the spot. Because I didn't have any business cards yet, 2 bridesmaids took my contact info written on craft paper in florist's crayon, which kept June laughing at me for the entire drive home. A shift had occurred, and I could sense it in the same way you feel a change in the seasons through a window pane before opening the door. The stall was no longer just a stall. It was transforming into something that required an actual name. By the time Labor Day weekend arrived, a name had been chosen. My closest friend, Maddie Price, had been showing up at the market on Saturdays since June. Initially, she came just to gossip, but later she stayed for a wage. She was the one who sanded down an old fence board, painted Bishop Blooms on it in buttermilk white, and attached it to the market stall before I even had a chance to object. Bishop Blooms, my own name painted for the public to see. Standing there, I felt completely exposed, a reaction that reveals everything about the way I was brought up. Once September arrived, the whole operation could pass for a legitimate business if you looked at it with a generous squint. We had 20 5-porch subscription clients who received a wrapped bouquet every Friday. Our most successful Saturdays at the market brought in over $600. Pictures from Hannah's wedding were currently being shared among every engaged girl in the county. I paid June for our second season ahead of schedule and in full cash, mostly just to watch her try to suppress a smile. And she accepted the money while pointing out that my trellis rows were crooked, which, coming from June, was her way of saying congratulations. I need you to pay close attention to this next detail, though, because it is crucial for what happens later. I still spent my time working in the back of the stall. It was Maddie who did all the talking with the customers. I kept the brim of my hat pulled down low and made sure my hands stayed busy. Certain habits are foundational. Being noticed still felt like stepping through a doorway where I hadn't been invited. Meanwhile, the Sunday church bulletins from Grandma Ruth kept arriving. Brianna had dropped out of her online class back in June and had gone completely quiet. My mother had stopped bringing me up at church, which Ruth noted was a statement all on its own. The entire town was doing the kind of math that my mother had no power to stop. After all, a girl who supposedly stormed off in anger over a party doesn't typically reappear a year later with a cultivation field, a business sign, and a customer waiting list. Then, on the Tuesday immediately following Labor Day, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number from the county newspaper. The very first thing I told the friendly reporter on the line was no. Her name was Dana Whitfield, and she was the writer for the paper's Farm and Table column. Someone from the market had tipped her off. My chief suspect was the woman who sold goat milk soap, who seemed to view my life as a running drama series. Dana wanted to write a feature profile, the story of a young grower, the heirloom dahlias, the whole package. Yet, before my brain could even register the request, my mouth blurted out, "Oh, no thank you," driven by the automatic reflex of a girl raised from birth to pass the microphone down the table. I shared the story with June that evening, expecting her to agree with me, since she regarded media attention with the exact same disgust she felt for aphids. Instead, she set her coffee mug down with a sharp click. She told me that for a year, other people had been telling my story at every dinner table in the county, and I had handed them the pen simply because keeping my head down felt like good manners. Pushing her mug aside, she warned me that if I hid my face, people would continue to write my story for me. She said the reporter was offering to hand the pen back, and I needed to take it. The next morning, I called Dana back. She showed up on Thursday along with a photographer, spent 2 hours walking through my flower rows, and asked the kinds of questions no one in my family had ever thought to ask. Why dahlias? Why choose flowers at all? What had the frost taught me? What did the sign actually represent? When the photographer started searching for a setting, I made the absolute bravest choice I'd made since a September night when I left with 2 duffel bags. I didn't shield myself behind a giant bundle of stems, nor did I make Maddie stand next to me. I stood completely alone, right in the middle of the crimson row in my work apron, with dirt on my knuckles, looking directly into the camera lens. The piece was published the following Thursday on the front page of the features section. By noon that day, my mother had already read it. By that Thursday evening, so had every single person to whom she had ever pitched her own version of events. The printed title announced, "The 18-year-old behind Bishop Blooms." There on the page was the field, the sign, the velvety red dahlias, and me staring at the camera like a person who actually had every right to be in a photograph. Dana's writing was clear and warm, highlighting my greenhouse job at 14. The leased 2 acres, the frost, the wedding, and the heirloom flower bulbs from my grandmother. She made absolutely no mention of my parents, which actually spoke much louder and resonated more deeply than anything she could have printed. The town figured everything out in a single sitting. Unfamiliar women joined our subscription list, leaving encouraging notes like, "So proud of you, honey." The church ladies who had once scrutinized my sweet peas now stopped by the booth just to say how pleased my grandmother must be. Just like that. My mother's version of the story, the tantrum, the party, the abandonment, collapsed quietly, the way a lie always does when a photograph enters the room. On Friday morning, she phoned. There was no hello. "You put our family's business in the newspaper, Celeste," she said. I pointed out that the article never even brought up the family. "Exactly," she shot back, her voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. "No, everyone is asking your sister what she is doing. When she goes to the pharmacy, or when she's at church. Have you even considered how that affects her? But naturally you wouldn't. You've always been fine. You can't possibly comprehend her situation." The staring across 2 acres of undeniable evidence, I replied softly, "You're absolutely right, Mom. I have no clue." With that, for the first time in my life, I cut the call before she could. As for Brianna, she remained completely silent, sending no text messages and passing no word through Ruth. In a household where emotions were always screamed at top volume, this quietness felt like a brand new weapon. I really ought to have questioned what that silence was building toward, because my grandmother was the next person to call, and she had a major demand. Grandma Ruth was reaching her 80th birthday at September's end. She rang me up directly, a rare occurrence since she viewed telephones as a passing trend. "They are organizing a celebration for me," she explained. "Patty wants to use the church hall, while your mother prefers her own house so she can control everything." She paused, and I could practically hear the grin on her face as she prepared to share her scheme. I told them I've spent 8 decades sitting in those exact rooms. My wish is to have my party right in your field, surrounded by something real. I've already broken the news to everyone in the family, making the announcement publicly so none of them could back out. I sat down on a bucket, shocked that she meant my field. Around 30 relatives, consisting of church leaders, their associates, both my parents, and the sister I hadn't seen for 12 months, would all be standing inside the life I had constructed from the ruins they left me. "Grandma," I pointed out, "Mom is never going to show up." "Oh, she'll show up," Ruth replied in an incredibly level tone. "If she missed my milestone birthday, after everything that has happened this year, she'd have to explain it to everyone. Your mother would literally rather eat broken glass than do that. That is precisely my reasoning, sweet pea. Since it is my birthday, I get to choose one gift. And I am choosing myself." She desired honesty in her presence, and she wanted it rooted in a spot where no one could drown it out. "Now, before we head out to that field together, I need you to tell me something truthfully in the comment section below. Would you have allowed them onto your property?" Because I was incredibly close to refusing. After we hung up, I spent a whole hour pacing among my roses, mentally debating with the dahlias. Put yourself in my shoes, the ruined birthday, the completely drained savings, the year of absolute radio silence. Let me know what your move would have been. And if this is your first time watching, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because a ruined 18th birthday celebration is about to culminate in an 80th. 7 days before the event, my mother reached out, claiming she needed a minor favor. Exactly half a month after I had cut our previous conversation short, she phoned me back, diving straight into the event details as though our conflict never occurred. She asked about the seating count, whether there would be enough shade, and if Patty ought to make her lemon bars. After that, she dropped a casual remark, much like quietly slipping a blade into a basket of food. Just a tiny detail. "Darling, in the future, when guests inquire about this farm, which they definitely will, it would make us so happy if you described it as a joint family endeavor. Because when you really analyze it, that is the truth. After all, you had to learn your drive and work ethic from somewhere. A sudden laugh escaped me, a single, sharp sound I was powerless to stop. She ignored it and kept talking, her tone turning sugary in that familiar way whenever she reached her actual motive for calling. Would believe it would promote healing. Doctor. Feldman agrees that it would be highly therapeutic if Brianna had some sort of involvement on the property. She could oversee gatherings, celebrations, and things of that nature, given her wonderful sense of style. You don't have to make an official announcement this Sunday. If the topic arises, just drop a mention that Brianna manages events for Bishop Bloom's. She really deserves a victory right now. Celeste, you've already achieved so many successes. And there she was, back in her role as the emotional debt collector. They had taken my party and drained my bank account, and now their demands were simply growing larger alongside my crops. My personal reputation, my own land, and my entire year of freezing temperatures and endless double shifts were being rebranded as a collaborative family effort. With my sister forced into the narrative like an organ transplant I was forced to tolerate. No, Mom, I replied, keeping my voice as steady as possible, which was incredibly level by that point. This farm is neither a gesture of regret nor a theatrical set, though you are all invited to attend this Sunday as our guests. I truly want you to be there. But the line remained quiet for a tense moment. Very well, she answered airily. I assumed I had successfully blocked her surprise attack, but in hindsight, I had only secured the main entrance. The celebration was scheduled for the final Sunday in September, marking nearly a year to the day since I had walked down my parents' staircase with nothing but 2 duffel bags. We spent Saturday preparing. Maddie and June dragged the lengthy tables down the main pathway separating the dahlia rows, while I threaded string lights along the fence posts and the small maple tree near the entrance. These were the identical lights I had previously envisioned for a backyard back on Maple Street. I recognized the connection, but I went ahead and put them up anyway. Regardless, we harvested 200 stalks of Ruth's deep red flowers and arranged them inside metal buckets spaced along the tables. The land looked incredibly beautiful, displaying that final late September burst where the dahlias show off their most vibrant colors just before the cold weather hits, almost as if they are aware of what is coming. During the middle of the afternoon, a recognizable pickup truck rolled slowly up the driveway. My father sat alone inside, bringing 40 metal folding chairs borrowed from the church. We hadn't stood face to face in a year. Stepping out of the truck, he stared down the pathways for several seconds before observing, "This soil has excellent drainage." In the vocabulary of my father, that was an expression of deep affection. For the next hour, we worked side by side placing the chairs, barely speaking. On 2 occasions, he paused, stood upright, and began to turn toward me with something to say, but each time he decided to keep his thoughts to himself, tucking them away just like those $60 in $5 bills. As he reached the exit to leave, he made one final attempt, managed to say, "Your grandmother is truly proud of you," and then departed back to the residence where my mother was likely busy prepping both their clothes and their narrative. Maddie walked up to me while I was staring at his receding taillights. "Are you prepared for tomorrow?" she inquired. "Absolutely not," I replied. "But go ahead and set up the coffee urn regardless." By the following afternoon, 31, a parade of my relatives stepped onto my property. Every last one of them showed up, including her, most notably her. Driving up the driveway in a line of practical cars, 31 guests laid eyes on my land for the very first time as I looked on. As they reached the entrance, the impact registered on every single face. My aunts fell silent in the middle of speaking, my cousins hoisted their mobile phones to take photos, and Uncle Ray went so far as to remove his hat. Autumn's final days in September had decorated the landscape far more beautifully than any effort of my own. 200 deep red dahlia lined the length of the tables, bathed in a warm golden twilight, while scarlet roses seemed to glow all the way to the boundary fence. Grandma Ruth made an entrance worthy of a president, leaning on Patty's arm as she completed a single, leisurely walk down the middle path before taking her place at the main table to keep a watchful eye on both the dessert and the reality of the situation. Clad in her dark blue church attire, My mother exited her vehicle without a single trace of astonishment on her face. Credit where credit is due. Acting as though she were the event coordinator, she wandered among the tables, adjusting a container here, repositioning a pail there, and boasting to Aunt Carol that everyone had always recognized Celeste's natural talent, attributing it to her own lineage by claiming she was a gardener herself before having her daughters. Just like that, 12 months of anger and neglect were effortlessly smoothed over in a single day, replaced by the narrative of, "We always knew." Rather than fight it, I stayed silent. My flowers spoke for themselves without requiring my defense. Brianna was the final guest to show up, arriving 40 minutes behind schedule in an overly elegant gown suited for simple lawn seating, her hair styled so rigidly it resembled protective plating. After embracing Grandma Ruth for a quick picture, she accepted a cup of lemonade that she never actually tasted, choosing instead to wander the outer edges of the party by herself, analyzing my existence as if she were conducting a financial review. My eyes followed her as she paused by the entrance where the wooden sign made by Maddie was mounted, reading, "Bishop Bloom's Buttermilk White," and she remained there, completely motionless, far longer than a person typically gazes at a piece of wood. Suddenly, Patty was standing right beside me, holding a plate of lemon desserts and giving me a meaningful glance. When she inquired if I was all right, I realized it was her first confrontational question in an entire year. "Check back with me when the sun goes down," I replied. Right before the speeches were scheduled to begin, I slipped away to gather a final handful of flowers for the dessert table, only to discover my mother by herself at the very edge of the red flower rows, where the chatter of the guests faded into the gentle buzzing of insects. Unaware of my presence, she was gently resting 2 fingers against a massive, dinner plate-sized flower, her touch incredibly light, resembling how someone might cautiously feel a potentially hot burner or brush a resting infant. The expression on her face belonged to a place in her mind where she had never allowed me to enter. "She was similar rose grew back then," she murmured, speaking more to herself than to me. In the backyard of our Delancey Street home, I planted an entire tray of seeds during the spring of my 19th year. Zenas, heirs. I kept track of everything in a journal. I froze in place, mimicking how one might behave to avoid alerting an unsuspecting animal in the wild. But then Grandma Ellen fell ill. She continued, her hand slipping away from the blossom. It dragged on for 2 whole years, and the responsibility fell entirely on me. Denny couldn't bear the hospital environment, meaning I had to visit her daily, both before my morning shift and after my workday ended. Her fingers left the pedal. When she died, he inherited the truck, you see. Everyone sympathized with how difficult things were for him. Meanwhile, my tray of seedlings withered away on the ledge because no one bothered to give them water. They were all too occupied offering words of encouragement to Denny about the strength he would need to find. Yet for just a brief second, standing amid the flowers my own labor had produced, I perceived her clearly and completely, a young woman holding a diary, crushed by the exact same family dynamics 3 decades prior to my own experiences. A lump formed in my throat, and I came incredibly close to telling her, "Mom, I understand." In my whole life, that was the nearest we ever got to a real connection. But then she suddenly became aware of my presence. Her posture immediately stiffened back up, and that rare, vulnerable stranger vanished from her expression, as quickly as a lamp being extinguished in a distant country home. "Such is life, Celeste," she muttered sharply, spinning around to head back to the seating area. "Those with strength are the ones who bear the burden. That is the definition of love." With those words, she rejoined the gathering. I lingered among the flowers, letting the hum of the bees fill the quiet air, until the sharp clinking of metal against a drinking glass echoed across the field. Grandma Ruth rose to her feet entirely unassisted, making sure everyone took notice of her independence, and lifted her glass of lemonade toward the open land. "Across 80 years," she announced, "I have celebrated my birthdays inside household kitchens, parish basements, and during one unforgettable year, a hospital room. Yet, this marks the very first time I am celebrating surrounded by genuine truth." Gesturing toward the pails of deep red dahlia arranged on the tables, she continued, "This specific flower was first cultivated by my own mother. I carried on the tradition by planting it when Tommy was born, continuing to do so every subsequent year. Then, this past autumn, I passed the bulbs along to my granddaughter, knowing a bloom of this caliber requires someone willing to work through the freezing cold. And I recognized dedicated, hardworking hands when I look at them. Staring directly at me, her lower jaw shook slightly, though her tone remained completely steady as she added, that particular blossom has never possessed an official name. Therefore, I am christening it right now before all of you, so the name becomes permanent Ruth's Crimson. Cultivated by Celeste Bishop on her very own farm. In 3 decades, this land is the most authentic creation our family has ever produced." Hearty, sincere clapping erupted, and 31 pairs of eyes shifted in my direction. For the first time ever, I allowed myself to be the center of attention without scanning the room for a way out. Right then, my mother leaped up from her seat with a beaming grin and her drink raised high, hijacking the crowd's energy, as if she were leaping onto a moving train car. "I have another wonderful announcement to share while we are all gathered here," she proclaimed, her voice projecting all the way to the boundaries of the field. "Surely you've seen the newspaper articles about Celeste. Well, we are officially turning Bishop Blooms into a collaborative family enterprise. Get up on your feet, Brianna dear!" She will be managing all the celebrations and gatherings held right here on the property. Our 2 daughters, working side by side. We couldn't be prouder of our girls. Another round of applause followed, though it sounded hesitant. The kind of polite noise people make when they sense tension, but hesitate to acknowledge it. Further down the seating arrangement, Aunt Patty locked eyes with me, posing her question just as Brianna began to stand beside our mother, gripping a glass that was already trembling. I kept my tone perfectly calm. Looking back on that moment over the years, I know for sure I didn't shout. Decades of self-control don't just vanish, even when panic sets in. I stared across the length of the table past 30, one of our relatives, to face my mother directly. "That isn't the truth, Mom," I told her. "And we aren't going to brush this off like a weather forecast." The hesitant applause sputtered out. A frozen grin remained on my mother's face, though her expression betrayed a sudden panic as she parted her lips to try and salvage the moment. She was highly skilled at controlling the narrative when given space, but she lost her chance when Brianna slammed her glass onto the table and let out an entirely foreign noise. It was a completely hollow, broken laugh. "Obviously it is a lie," Brianna declared, her voice booming before climbing even higher. "Our entire family is a sham. Are you all eager to applaud us? Do you really want to know the truth about the girls?" Her pitch rose so sharply it seemed to silence the surrounding nature. "I was the one who was promised everything," she screamed. "That was our arrangement. The entire agreement." She pivoted back and forth, addressing the gathered family members like a spinning sprinkler. "Do you honestly believe Celeste did this on her own? Our parents called off her 18th birthday celebration simply because I threw a tantrum. They threw out the party, kept the actual cake, scraped her name off, wrote mine, and I was the one who ate it." Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her makeup as more than 2 decades of carefully cultivated helplessness evaporated instantly. Then there is the issue of her finances, which you all need to hear. They confiscated $8,500 of Celeste's hard-earned savings. It was her money, her own wages, and they handed it over to fund my life in Columbus. I squandered every single penny in less than 2 weeks, just like I do with everything else. My mother stood up immediately, calling out her name with the frantic urgency of a medical crisis. "Brianna, darling, you are having an episode." Brianna spun around violently, throwing her arm out and striking the zinc bucket resting on the main table. In agonizingly slow motion, the container tipped. Water drenched the white tablecloth as 24 of Ruth's red dahlias rolled out across the green autumn grass for all of our relatives to see. Amidst the profound silence that followed, a pale-faced Aunt Patty rose, stared directly at my mother, and demanded, "You claimed she walked away because of a birthday party." The most vivid memory I have of the succeeding moment is the stillness of dozens of onlookers frozen in the field. Over by the coffee dispenser, June stood with folded arms, tracking my mother's movements with the intensity of someone watching a predator circle a prey. Brianna wept into her palms, completely drained of energy and looking more fragile than she ever had before. Meanwhile, my mother was down on the lawn in her dark blue dress, picking up the scattered dahlias individually to occupy herself while her reputation crumbled around her. Looking up at me, she whispered a quiet command meant only for my ears while the crowd behind me waited in suspense. "Make this right." Though tearful, her gaze remained unwavering as she continued. "You have the power to repair this, Celeste. Explain to them that the birthday issue was just a miscommunication. Tell everyone we provided the funding for your farm. As your mother and father, it is practically the truth. Just hire Brianna to manage your events. If you do that, our family will be whole again. You can return to us. You will have your old bedroom, our weekend meals, and your family back. You are finally allowed to come home, my darling." This is the crucial detail I desperately desired that offer. Even after 11 years, I can admit that truth without shame. Every childish instinct within me craved her acceptance because it represented the ultimate validation, finally within my reach. My mother was begging for my return, though it came with a steep price. The transaction required the usual payment: diminish my own reality, surrender my history, put their names on my business, and fade into the background at my own gathering. I glanced down at her cradling my grandmother's blossoms. Behind me, I could sense the quiet realization washing over the crowd as they finally understood the situation. "You speak the truth, Mother," I responded, my tone remaining completely flat. "I have managed perfectly well by myself, a skill you spent years ensuring I perfected." Her grip on the flower stalks tightened. "However, I will not purchase my place in this family. I refuse to trade my honesty, my business, or my own identity for it. I am happy to host both of you as visitors whenever you wish on Sundays. That is my only proposal, and the terms are non-negotiable." My mother stood up gradually, still clutching the flowers, and for a fleeting moment, I dared to hope, but she simply placed the stems on the wood like exhibits in a courtroom, grabbed Brianna's hand, and exited my property without a single backward glance. To this day, she has never returned. Rather than breaking up abruptly, the gathering seemed to let out a collective sigh. Ruth proclaimed to the crowd that this was the finest birthday celebration she had experienced in 8 decades. Dare anyone challenge her, which somehow allowed the guests to linger for another 60 minutes. Aunt Patty sliced the cake with trembling fingers, occasionally glancing my way with the bewildered expression of someone realizing they had completely misunderstood a vital piece of information. My father, however, remained by the entrance long after my mother's vehicle departed. I only realized afterward that he had purposefully chosen to arrive with Uncle Ray instead of her. As I handed him his coat, he spun his hat in his grasp as though navigating a vehicle. "I ought to have spoken up on your 18th birthday," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the ground. "My silence has lasted 2 decades, Celeste, yet it ended up being the most deafening choice I ever made." I simply told him that I understood, refusing to offer a reassuring lie. I was finished telling people things were fine when they weren't. "I am aware, Dad," was all I said. He gave a nod, climbed into Ray's vehicle, and headed back to the home he had selected every day of my upbringing, because he was simply who he was. Yet when November arrived, his correspondence began a monthly letter written in a sharp, wire-like hand that spanned precisely 4 lines at a time. He mentioned spotting dahlias on a calendar at the feed store and thinking of me, or noted how early the ground had frozen that season. He signed them, Dad, and I saved every single one. As the final set of taillights disappeared, Maddie and June began stacking up the chairs, while Ruth stood guard over the empty cake plate. I slipped away alone, heading to the far end of the crimson row as a cold, blue evening settled over us. Near the overturned bucket, a single broken stem lay on the ground. I picked it up and stood in the dark field that belonged to me, finally understanding the one truth I had spent the entire year avoiding. I had stopped paying my rent 12 months ago. But I was still waiting for the landlord to drive past, spot the garden, and want me back. That expectation was gone now. It had walked right out of the field on its own 2 feet. Behind me, Ruth's voice floated down the rows as she directed Maddie to place the snapped stem in some water. She shouted out that cut flowers aren't dead flowers, urging someone to bring it inside. In that quiet aftermath, everything finally settled into place. Our family fractured in the exact manner the townspeople still talk about. The following weekend, Patty visited the farm bringing lemon bars and a handwritten apology she read to me at the potting bench so she wouldn't mess up her words. Both of us acted as if June wasn't listening from the seed room next door. Sunday dinners moved to Grandma Ruth's tiny kitchen on Maple Street. It was Ruth, Patty, Maddie about half the time, and me, smelling of cooler water and eucalyptus. At that table, nobody has ever asked me to shrink myself. For a while, my mother tried out a different narrative. She claimed Brianna was simply exhausted and Celeste was just going through a phase, saying it was typical for girls. But a story requires listeners, and hers kept shifting their allegiance to the other side, literally, in some cases. She still lives just 2 miles up the road. We haven't spoken since the moment she walked out of the field, and I've accepted that we likely never will, because peace was only available at a cost I no longer pay. My father continues to send his 4-line letters every month, slipping a $20 bill inside at Christmas like contraband, loving me from within a boundary he constructed himself. I have stopped evaluating his efforts. It's simply what he has to give. Then there was Brianna. Late one winter night, past midnight, my phone lit up with the first words my sister had sent me in over a year. The flowers were beautiful. Nothing more. No apology and no follow-up. When I spotted her across the pharmacy in March, she kept her eyes fixed on her shoes. I later heard she moved in with a friend in Columbus, and of all things on this earth, got a job at a garden center. I never replied to her message, but I never deleted it either. Some seeds you just leave in the packet to see how you feel when spring arrives. The farm kept being a farm, which is the quiet miracle of such places. By April, we had sold out our subscriptions for the 3rd season. Come May, we planted 300 tubers of Ruth's Crimson. All of them descended from that original shoebox. Then in June, a 14-year-old girl named Sadi started showing up, a 4-H member. She was quiet and gangly, the kind of kid who wins ribbons with nobody in the stands to watch. Her mother needed her to be zero trouble, and Sadi aimed to please, a type I recognized instantly. I pay her actual wages and require her to invoice me verbally while looking me in the eye. The first time she managed to do it without offering an apology, I gave her an immediate raise. Last week, I saw her with hands on her hips, directing a customer's child away from the seedling trays, occupying the entire doorway. I had to step into the cooler for a moment just to compose myself. If you ask me, she is the harvest I am most proud of, not the flowers. That girl is learning 3 years earlier than I did that she is allowed to bill people for what she provides, and that anyone who only loves her when she is invisible is not family. They are merely a landlord with your childhood photos, hanging on their walls. If I could carve one lesson onto a fence post for every independent young woman to read, it would be this: love that you must earn by disappearing isn't love. It is rent, and the moment you stop paying it, you finally discover who is truly family and who is just collecting a fee. That is my story. A canceled cake, a shoe box of dahlia tubers, 2 acres, and 1 signature. If you have been the strong one at your family's table, I hope you plant something of your own this year and stand where you can be seen. Tell me in the comments what you would have said in that field. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe to Last Laugh Stories. Next week, another woman tells her whole truth, calmly, to the very end.